India has never lacked ambition, talent, or the ability to solve difficult problems. What has recently changed is the scale at which those strengths are now being turned into systems, technologies, and ideas that can compete in the world. Despite working with a much larger population and often tighter resources than many wealthy nations, India has created solutions that are faster, more affordable, more efficient, and in a lot of cases, genuinely better than those in the richest countries. These aren't just claims, the numbers prove it. Here are 15 things India is doing remarkably better than some of the world's richest countries. Number 15, making life-changing healthcare accessible to everyone. We start with something genuinely humbling. An Indian nonprofit called Jaipur Foot has fitted nearly 700,000 people with artificial limbs, completely free of charge, since it began. What makes the Jaipur Foot itself remarkable isn't just the price, it's the design. Most prosthetics developed in wealthy countries are optimized for walking on flat pavement in shoes. The Jaipur Foot was designed for how people in rural India actually live: barefoot, squatting, sitting cross-legged, walking on uneven muddy fields, climbing trees, and pedaling bicycles. It's now considered the most widely used prosthetic foot on the entire planet, precisely because it was engineered around how ordinary human bodies actually move, not around a hospital lab in a rich country. A comparable prosthetic limb in the United States can easily run into the tens of thousands of dollars, often only partially covered by insurance. Jaipur Foot fits someone with a working durable limb, walks them out the same day in many cases, and charges them nothing at all. Number 14. Producing basic essentials at an unmatched scale. India produces around 227 million tons of milk a year, making it the largest milk producer on Earth, more than the entire European Union's roughly 150 million tons, and more than double the United States output of around 102 million tons. It didn't happen through giant industrial megadairies either. It happened through a cooperative model built around Amul, starting in the 1940s and 50s, where millions of small farmers, often with just one or two cows or buffaloes, pool their milk together and share in the profits. It's called the White Revolution, and it turned a country that used to import milk powder into the single largest dairy producer on the planet, built almost entirely on small family farms rather than corporate agribusiness. Somewhere in the ballpark of 80 million Indian households still earn part of their living from dairy farming today, meaning that world-leading production number isn't the output of a handful of giant companies. It's the combined output of tens of millions of individual farmers, most of them managing just a cow or two. Take a breath here, because notice the pattern already forming across these entries. A charity fitting prosthetics for free, a dairy industry built on family farms instead of mega corporations. None of these are flashy tech breakthroughs. They're just systems built to actually work at the scale India needed them to work at. Number 13. Making the internet affordable for almost everyone. A gigabyte of mobile data in India costs a small fraction of what it costs in most wealthy countries. Indian data plans regularly work out to well under $1 per gigabyte, at a time when the global average sits above $4 per gigabyte, and users in parts of Europe and North America routinely pay several times India's rate. This isn't a subsidy from the government. It's the result of a brutal price war between Indian telecom companies competing for hundreds of millions of new smartphone users all at once, which pushed prices down to levels most rich country telecom executives would consider commercially impossible. The knock-on effect has been enormous. Cheap data turned hundreds of millions of first-time internet users into video streaming, app-using, UPI-paying smartphone owners within just a few years, something that took much longer and cost users far more in most wealthy countries. Number 12. Making clean energy cheaper. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, India now generates utility-scale solar power at around $35 per megawatt hour, narrowly beating China's $36, comfortably beating Brazil, and sitting well below the global average of $44 per megawatt hour. That's not a small country with a handful of solar panels. That's one of the largest solar markets on the planet, delivering some of the cheapest clean electricity anywhere, cheaper than most wealthy nations manage, despite India having far less capital to throw at the problem. Solar costs everywhere have fallen dramatically over the last decade and a half. But India has consistently ridden that curve down faster and further than most of the wealthy countries that actually invented much of the underlying panel technology in the first place. Number 11. Building new companies at enormous scale. India now has the third largest startup ecosystem on Earth, trailing only the United States and China, with more than 110 unicorn companies, startups valued at over $1 billion each. That puts India ahead of the UK, Germany, France, Japan, and every other traditionally wealthy economy in the sheer number of billion-dollar startups being built. A country where the average person earns a fraction of what a Californian or a Londoner earns has still managed to outproduce nearly every rich country on Earth when it comes to building genuinely new, globally competitive companies from scratch. That includes fintech companies serving hundreds of millions of newly banked customers, e-commerce platforms built for a billion-plus population, and increasingly, artificial intelligence startups competing directly with companies backed by far deeper-pocketed venture capital markets abroad. Number 10. Making healthcare affordable for the world. India supplies roughly 20% of all generic medicines sold anywhere on the planet. But here's the number that really lands the point. Around 40% of all generic drugs dispensed in the United States, and about a third of those dispensed in the United Kingdom, are made in India. Two of the wealthiest healthcare systems in the world depend on Indian factories to keep basic medicine affordable for their own citizens. Next time someone in America or Britain picks up a cheap generic prescription instead of paying full price for the branded version, there's a very good chance the pill in their hand was manufactured in India. This entire industry traces back to a 1970 Indian law that allowed domestic drug makers to reverse engineer patented medicines and manufacture affordable versions legally, a policy decision that decades later is quietly helping keep prescription costs down for tens of millions of people in some of the wealthiest healthcare systems on Earth. Number 9. Moving money faster and cheaper than almost anywhere else. India's UPI, the instant payment system that allows almost anyone to transfer money directly between bank accounts using a phone number, a payment address, or simply a QR code, has grown into the largest real-time digital payments ecosystem in the world. According to the International Monetary Fund, India now accounts for around 49% of all real-time digital payment transactions globally. In one recent year alone, the country processed around 129.3 billion such transactions, more than Brazil, Thailand, China, and South Korea combined. And the impressive part is not simply the number of transactions. It is how ordinary the technology has become. In India, you can walk into an expensive shopping mall and pay through UPI, but you can also stop at a tiny roadside tea stall, buy vegetables from a cart, pay an auto rickshaw driver, or send 20 rupees to someone standing beside you, and the exact same payment infrastructure works. A printed QR code costing almost nothing can give a very small business access to digital payments without the merchant needing an expensive card terminal or complicated banking equipment. That is where the comparison with many wealthy countries becomes interesting. Large parts of the United States and Europe still depend heavily on credit and debit card networks, where merchants may pay processing fees every time a customer taps a card. Paper checks have also survived far longer in countries like America than many Indians would probably expect. India essentially jumped over some of those older systems and built something directly around smartphones and bank accounts. For an ordinary person, that means splitting a restaurant bill, paying rent, buying groceries, or sending money to a family member can happen within seconds. For a small merchant, it means accepting digital money without having to invest heavily in equipment. And because hundreds of millions of people use the same infrastructure, the system becomes more useful with every new person who joins it. India did not simply digitize an existing payment culture, it created a new one at enormous scale, and then made it so convenient that people began using digital payments for transactions that would once have been considered too small to bother putting through a bank. Number 8. Moving more people than any rich country has to. Indian Railways moves roughly 23 million passengers every single day. To understand how enormous that number is, Imagine almost the entire population of Australia getting onto trains every morning, traveling somewhere, getting off, and then repeating the same exercise again the next day. And Indian Railways does this across one of the most geographically complicated countries in the world. The network connects enormous metropolitan areas such as Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, and Chennai, but it also reaches small towns and rural districts where rail may still be the most practical way for millions of people to travel long distances. Trains cross deserts in Rajasthan, mountains in the north, forests, coastal areas, flood-prone regions, and some of the most densely populated corridors anywhere on Earth. There are wealthier countries with faster trains. Japan has its Shinkansen, France has the TGV, China has built the largest high-speed rail system in the world. India itself is now expanding faster and more modern rail services as well. But the achievement here is different. It is the sheer number of human beings the system has to move while keeping travel affordable. Railway fares in India remain heavily subsidized compared with many wealthy countries. A journey covering hundreds of kilometers can cost a fraction of what a passenger would pay for a comparable rail trip in Britain, Japan, or parts of Western Europe. That affordability matters because Indian Railways is not primarily a premium transport system for wealthy commuters. It is a national lifeline used by students, workers, families, business travelers, tourists, and people traveling across the country for work, education, or medical treatment. And when you multiply 23 million daily passenger journeys across an entire year, the numbers become extraordinary. Indian Railways carries billions of passenger journeys annually, while also moving enormous quantities of freight, food, coal, industrial materials, and other goods across the same national network. It may not yet be the fastest or most technologically advanced railway system in every category, but very few countries have ever had to solve the transportation problem India faces that has moved tens of millions of people every day over enormous distances at prices that ordinary citizens can still afford. Number 7. Bringing hundreds of millions into the banking system. Most people living in wealthy countries grow up assuming that having a bank account is completely normal. You get paid into one, save money in one, receive government benefits through one, and use it to access everything from loans to digital payments. But in India, hundreds of millions of people entered the 21st century without that basic connection to the formal financial system. That is the problem Jan Dhan Yojana was designed to solve. Through the program, India has opened more than 590 million bank accounts, many of them for people who previously had little or no access to formal banking. The speed of the rollout was so extraordinary that the program received Guinness World Records recognition during its early phase for the number of accounts opened in a short period. And opening the account was only the first step. India had to work out how to serve people living in villages where there was no traditional bank branch nearby, where incomes might be irregular, where paperwork could become a major barrier, and where maintaining an account had previously made very little financial sense for commercial banks. The answer was a combination of Aadhaar identity, mobile phones, zero balance accounts, and hundreds of thousands of local banking correspondents who effectively bring basic financial services into communities that conventional banks could not economically reach. Money that might previously have been stored as cash inside a home can now sit securely in a bank account. Government benefits can be deposited directly. Families begin establishing formal financial histories. People gain easier access to insurance, pensions, and other services that become much harder to provide when an individual exists completely outside the banking system. More than 315,000 crore rupees, well over $35 billion, now sits in these accounts. Much of it represents people who were gradually pulled from an informal cash economy into the formal financial system. India did not have the luxury of solving universal banking gradually over many generations. It had to bring hundreds of millions of people into the system within roughly a decade. And that required building a banking model around the realities of India rather than simply copying how wealthy countries had done it. Number 6. A welfare system for the people who need it. Once hundreds of millions of people had bank accounts and reliable digital identities, India could tackle another enormous problem. How do you make sure government money actually reaches the person it was intended for? For decades, welfare payments in India often traveled through multiple layers of administration before reaching the final recipient. Every additional layer created more paperwork, more delays, and more opportunities for duplicate beneficiaries, fake records, or money simply disappearing somewhere along the way. India's direct benefit transfer system changed that process by sending many government subsidies and welfare payments directly into a citizen's bank account. The concept sounds almost obvious today, but making it work across a country of more than 1.4 billion people required Aadhaar, bank accounts, digital verification, and government databases to work together at a scale few countries had ever attempted. The Indian government estimates that direct benefit transfer has produced savings of around 3.48 lakh crore rupees, or more than $40 billion, by removing duplicate or ineligible beneficiaries and reducing different forms of leakage. $40 billion is an enormous amount of money. It is larger than the annual government expenditure of many countries, and it was not generated by discovering oil or raising a new tax. Much of it came simply from improving the plumbing of government, making sure that money allocated to a beneficiary had a much more direct route from the state to that person's bank account. This also changes the experience for the recipient. Instead of traveling repeatedly to government offices, depending on intermediaries, or waiting for paperwork to move through several levels, a payment can arrive directly in the same bank account that person now uses for other financial services. Wealthy countries also struggle with welfare fraud and administrative inefficiency. India's achievement is not that it somehow eliminated every problem completely, but that it built a digital delivery system capable of reducing those problems across a population larger than North America and Europe combined. Number 5. Giving the largest, fastest digital ID rollout in human history. At the center of many of these systems sits Aadhaar. India's Aadhaar program has enrolled more than 1.3 billion people and given each person a unique 12-digit identity number connected to biometric information including fingerprints, iris scans, and a photograph. That makes Aadhaar the largest biometric identification system ever created. And the number becomes even harder to appreciate when you consider how quickly the system was built. Most of that billion-plus enrollment happened within roughly a decade. Imagine trying to identify almost every person in Europe, North America, Japan, and several other countries combined, while many of them live in remote villages, do not necessarily have existing identity documentation, speak different languages, and may be hundreds of kilometers from a major city. That was the logistical problem India had to solve. Enrollment centers had to capture biometric information reliably. Duplicate identities had to be identified. Data had to be processed at massive scale. The system then had to become usable across banking, government programs, telecommunications, and other services. Many wealthy democracies have spent decades debating whether they even want a national identity system, often because of concerns over privacy, government surveillance, and data security. Those concerns also exist in India and deserve serious discussion. Aadhaar has faced legal challenges, privacy debates, and legitimate questions over how biometric information should be protected and where identity requirements should or should not be used. But separate the political debate from the engineering achievement for a moment. Creating a usable biometric identity system for well over 1 billion people in roughly a decade is an administrative project with almost no precedent. And Aadhaar became much more powerful because India did not leave it as a simple identity card. It became one layer of a larger digital system that could connect identity with bank accounts, mobile phones, and government services. That connection is one reason several of the other achievements on this list became possible at all. Number 4. Building digital systems. Other countries are now copying. Building digital infrastructure for 1.4 billion people would already be impressive. But the stronger sign that India may have created something genuinely useful is that other governments increasingly want to learn from it. India's digital public infrastructure model, usually discussed through technologies such as Aadhaar, UPI, and DigiLocker, has attracted interest from countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. Around 24 countries have adopted, partnered on, or explored elements inspired by India's digital public infrastructure. For much of modern history, developing countries imported institutional and technological models from richer countries. Governments looked toward America, Europe, or Japan for examples of how banking systems, identity systems, or public administration should work. India is exporting some of those ideas in the opposite direction. Officials from other countries have visited India to understand how digital identity can be built cheaply, how instant payment networks can operate between banks, and how government services can be connected without requiring every ministry to build an entirely separate technological system from scratch. Many developing countries face exactly the problems India faced: huge populations, large informal economies, limited numbers of bank branches, expensive government administration, and millions of citizens who need access to services without every interaction requiring a physical office. India had to solve those problems under severe cost constraints. And because the systems were designed for enormous scale from the beginning, pieces of that model can be especially interesting to countries that cannot afford to spend Western levels of money on every citizen. That may ultimately be one of India's most important technology exports: a set of digital building blocks that governments themselves can use to run national systems. Number 3, running the largest democratic election in human history. Then there is democracy itself. India's 2024 general election involved more than 642 million people actually casting a vote. That number alone is larger than the entire population of almost every country on Earth. But counting voters does not really explain how difficult the operation is. India has to create polling access across Himalayan villages, deserts, islands, forests, enormous cities and communities so remote that election officials sometimes travel for hours or days simply to reach a very small number of voters. Electronic voting machines have to be transported securely. Electoral rolls have to be prepared. Millions of election workers and security personnel have to be deployed. Polling stations have to function in dozens of languages and across states with wildly different geography and infrastructure. And all of this happens under one democratic principle: distance should not prevent an eligible citizen from voting. That is why stories regularly emerge of Indian election workers traveling by boat, trekking through forests, crossing difficult mountain terrain, or using animals to carry equipment into isolated communities. In some cases, extraordinary effort is made to establish a polling station for only a tiny number of voters. The 2024 election was conducted across roughly 1 million polling stations, and after weeks of voting across different phases, results for the entire country were counted and announced within days. Wealthy democracies certainly run sophisticated elections of their own, but no wealthy democracy has ever had to organize a national vote for a population remotely close to India's size. The achievement is not that Indian elections are free from political controversy. They are not. Every democracy has arguments over institutions, campaigning, media, voting systems, and fairness. The achievement here is logistical. India repeatedly organizes the largest democratic exercise human beings have ever attempted, and then does it again roughly every 5 years. Number 2, vaccinating the planet on a schedule. No rich country could match. India's pharmaceutical strength becomes even clearer when you move from generic medicines to vaccines. The Serum Institute of India is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world by number of doses produced. That means one Indian company has manufacturing capacity on a scale that many far richer countries do not possess domestically. And vaccine manufacturing is not as simple as producing more tablets on an assembly line. Vaccines require highly controlled biological manufacturing, strict quality standards, cold chain infrastructure, and the ability to produce enormous numbers of doses consistently without compromising safety. India spent decades building that capability. The importance became obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic. India administered more than 2 billion vaccine doses domestically, creating one of the largest vaccination programs in history. Doing that meant manufacturing vaccines, moving them across an enormous country, storing them at the correct temperature, scheduling appointments, maintaining records, and getting doses into villages as well as major cities. Think about the logistics behind 2 billion injections. Every dose requires a vial, a syringe, trained staff, a location, transport, storage, and a record showing who received it. India had to repeat that process billions of times. And while it was vaccinating its own population, Indian manufacturers were also producing vaccines that reached many other countries. Serum Institute's scale is particularly important for lower-income nations because Its entire business model has historically been built around producing enormous volumes at relatively low cost. That is why India is frequently described as the pharmacy of the developing world. The country did not simply build medical manufacturing capacity for itself. It built enough capacity that health systems outside India increasingly depend on Indian factories as well. Rich countries may still dominate many of the world's most advanced pharmaceutical discoveries and research budgets, but when the challenge becomes producing huge quantities of medicine or vaccines at prices the rest of the planet can afford, India has developed an advantage that is very difficult to replicate quickly. Number one, doing world-class space missions for a fraction of the cost. And then we reach the example that perhaps captures India's entire approach better than anything else on this list: space exploration. In 2014, India's Mars orbiter mission, better known as Mangalyaan, successfully entered orbit around Mars. The mission cost roughly $74 million. Around the same period, the Hollywood film Gravity, a fictional story about astronauts in space, reportedly had a production budget of around $100 million. In other words, it cost Hollywood more to make a movie about space than it cost India to actually send a spacecraft to Mars. The comparison became famous because it sounds almost ridiculous, but underneath the joke is something important about how ISRO works. India's space agency developed a culture around cost discipline because it never had the budgets available to NASA or the giant Soviet and American space programs of the 20th century. Engineers were forced to make careful decisions about what a mission actually needed, reuse proven technologies where possible, and avoid adding costs simply because a larger budget allowed it. Mangalyaan became especially significant because India succeeded in reaching Mars orbit on its first attempt, something even major space powers had struggled to accomplish. Then came Chandrayaan-3. In 2023, India successfully landed a spacecraft near the Moon's south polar region, becoming the first country to achieve a soft landing in that part of the lunar surface. The United States had landed humans on the Moon decades earlier. The Soviet Union and China had also achieved major lunar milestones, but India became the first nation to land successfully in this specific region, one that scientists consider particularly interesting because permanently shadowed areas may contain water ice and other resources important for future exploration. And once again, the mission cost was remarkably low, roughly $75 million. Compare that with the scale of other major space programs. ISRO's annual budget is roughly $1.5 billion, while NASA operates with a budget of around $25 billion. NASA operates a vastly broader program involving human spaceflight, deep space science, major telescopes, planetary exploration, aeronautics, and enormous international missions. But the budget difference makes India's achievements unusually impressive. ISRO has built lunar missions, Mars missions, navigation satellites, launch vehicles, Earth observation systems, and commercial satellite services while operating with a fraction of the money available to the world's richest space agencies. Part of that culture came from necessity. India spent decades facing restrictions on access to advanced foreign technologies, forcing Indian scientists and engineers to develop domestic alternatives instead of simply purchasing everything overseas. That could have permanently slowed the program down. Instead, in many areas, it created an engineering culture that became extremely good at finding cheaper ways to accomplish a mission. Teams remained relatively small. Salaries and development costs were lower than in Western aerospace industries. Existing hardware was reused wherever possible. Missions were designed around specific objectives rather than simply adding more capability because the budget allowed it. That philosophy eventually became one of ISRO's greatest strengths. India does not spend the most money in space. It does not launch the most missions, and it does not possess every capability that the United States or China has. But when the question becomes how much scientific and technological achievement a country can extract from every dollar it spends, India has repeatedly produced results that force much richer countries to pay attention. That is why space belongs at number one. Because perhaps more than anything else on this list, it proves that having less money does not automatically mean achieving less. Sometimes it simply forces you to become much better at using what you have. Put all these examples together. These are completely different industries and completely different problems, yet many of the Indian solutions share the same basic philosophy. They had to work for enormous numbers of people, but had to remain affordable, and they had to function in conditions where throwing unlimited amounts of money at the problem was never an option. When your system needs to serve hundreds of millions of people who may each have relatively little money, expensive solutions simply do not scale. So India learned to build differently. That is the thread connecting nearly everything on this list. If this video gave you a new appreciation for what India is building and achieving with far fewer resources than many wealthy nations, then share it with someone who would also enjoy seeing this side of India. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.